Hello, Whitefish. Being a Montanan, I don't really get out much, so I decided to take a stroll over to Washington, D.C., capital of the United States of the USA. Behind me is a life-size replica of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America. Huh, neat. Let's go check it out. Good Lord, Abraham Lincoln was massive. I love you, man. Wish you were here right now. Oh, look, a penny. Hey, I know this guy. It all makes sense now. Love you, Grandpa. Cool. Nice. Well, that house has an obnoxiously large front yard. I wonder who lives over there. Today's guests are Nic McKinley and Zack Armstrong. During the 2021 American troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, with the Taliban seizing control of the country, the White House sought the help of McKinley to spearhead the rescue and evacuation of the Afghan youth girls' national soccer team, who were being hunted by the Taliban. Nic, a former Air Force pararescueman and CIA agent with 30 tours under his belt, along with the help of Zack, a former Navy SEAL of 25 years, orchestrated and executed an unbelievably harrowing rescue mission out of a nondescript office space in, you guessed it, Whitefish, Montana. This is the first time the two have recounted their side of this incredible story publicly. You'll definitely want to saddle up for this one. Today's episode is brought to you by Thrivers Coffee. If you would like to help support the fight against human trafficking, visit thriverscoffee.com to order your coffee and make a difference today. Go Pills are a blend of 8 nootropic neurochargers that support focus, clarity, attention, fast recall, and decision-making. These have actually been tested by some of the U.S. military's top special operators who have given rave reviews to Go Pills. You can get 15% off your order when you use the code HELLO15 at checkout when you visit gopills.com. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Hello Whitefish today for a very special episode to talk about something called Operation Soccer Balls.
Thanks for having us. It's going to be fun.
Yes.
First time this story has ever been told publicly, and definitely the first time we've ever been in the same room telling the story. So it's a wild ride.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this story begins kind of February of 2020 when the U.S. began its withdrawal from Afghanistan, if I remember correctly, and that lasted until August of 2020. Where does this story start for the two of you? And why are we even talking about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan here in Whitefish, Montana?
Well, in case anybody was living under a rock at the time, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was nothing short of a dumpster fire. It was an absolute embarrassment to the United States of America, and we have allies. We have a lot of blood and treasure that we spent in that country. You know, I personally have, I think, like half a dozen deployments to Afghanistan. We're probably
deployed to Afghanistan, lost a lot of friends there.
Yeah,
for sure. Right.
So we got involved because the U.S. government was out of its depths and did not really understand how to execute helping allies and helping people who were somewhat disadvantaged, right? Women and children, and helping protect them from the Taliban. I don't think that the Biden administration had a healthy enough respect for the situation they were about to cause. And even though, you know, it's well documented that the CIA sent a descent cable, the State Department sent a descent cable, and that's a big deal. If anybody knows anything about the intelligence community and diplomatic community, if you send a descent cable to the White House, you are throwing your rank on the table, so to speak, and like that's a career ender. And so you had very well-educated and experienced professionals sending descent cables to the White House saying, this is a really bad idea, and if you do this, you will break Afghanistan. And they essentially said, we don't care, we're doing this anyway. And that is what led to the withdrawal. Okay, so all of that aside, now the withdrawal is happening. A lot of Americans, a lot of assets for the U.S. government who helped in all types of different capacities, and then a lot of women and girls were then stranded under Taliban rule. And okay, well, now we have that problem to fix. So all the politics aside, how do we help those people, and how do we do the right thing by not only our Afghan allies, but how do we do the right thing against the people who were relying on us for protection, and how do we do the right thing by our own people? That is a heavy, heavy lift to solve that problem. And then it kind of became all hands on deck. So USAID ended up, just to help anybody understand, USAID is responsible for providing aid to foreign countries, food aid, some economic aid. They're not responsible for personnel recovery operations in a combat zone. And USAID got handed essentially responsibility for evacuating certain groups of people out of the country. And that's not what they do. So one of the senior folks at USAID was actually a former CIA analyst that I worked with in Afghanistan. And so he started reaching out to all the people that he knew who might be able to help with this. And the phone chain eventually got to me. That was kind of the short story. So they called and said, hey, will you help out with these evacuations? Yes. I mean, what are we going to do? Say no? So we said, absolutely, yes, we will help out. And we started executing on a mechanism to exfiltrate people from Afghanistan, primarily through Kabul International Airport, with the help of the State Department and the military and all those folks, CIA, State Department. And we were helping with logistics and route planning, and then rally point planning for groups of journalists and American citizen students and aid workers and those types of things. And we called it the Johnny Express because the guy at USAID, his name was Johnny, and he worked directly for Samantha Powers. So he had a decent amount of political top cover, but at the same time, if things went wrong, it was going to be his head. So he was really putting his career on the line and quite frankly, doing some extremely courageous things. And Samantha Powers was involved enough in giving her, as the director of USAID, was involved enough in giving her blessing to him doing this, but it was very unofficial blessing. So you had this private-public partnership of a combination of volunteers and government contractors and government employees and nonprofits that all kind of came together to make this happen. And we started evacuating people originally through Eagle Base, which it's well documented. That was the CIA's base in Kabul. And we were evacuating them to Eagle Base, and then they were being moved through various means from Eagle Base to Hamid Karzai International Airport, and then being flown out of the country primarily to refugee camps in Qatar and Doha and places like that. So then we were working that mechanism. It was going really well. We started calling it the Johnny Express because it was just a very well-oiled mechanism for getting people out of the country, avoiding the Taliban, making sure that people were brought to the base in a way that kept our people safe, but also kept them safe, and again, avoided the Taliban. And then once we had this going, we finally one night, the Taliban had kind of figured out what was going on, and they were starting to put up more checkpoints, but weren't really causing a lot of problems, just kind of harassment, right? Which you can deal with. Then we got handed a mission, and we kind of became victims of our own success in this. We got handed a mission and asked if we would evacuate the Afghan girls national soccer team, right? So a lot of the soccer community and the national teams, they have the adult team, which is the professional team, right? That's your FIFA team. And then they have your essentially feeder team, which is made up of juveniles that will then, learn. And then as they grow older, will then become part of the national team. so the women's team had gotten out primarily by leveraging their networks, and I mean, they're grown adults, so they could figure out how to get themselves out. And they also had some help with some other organizations. Well, the girls' team was, I mean, some of them were 14 years old, I think.
14 was the youngest.
Yeah.
15 even.
Yeah, so they were, I mean, these are young teenage girls. And keep in mind that we've been at war in Afghanistan for over 20 years. So they did not know an Afghanistan pre-American occupation.
Oh.
Yeah.
And a lot had changed in Afghanistan. Like
It was
girls get education.
completely different.
Absolutely.
A lot
place.
more liberal, I guess you could say.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. In the classical liberal sense,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
And they didn't know. So what was happening? They were terrified. Their parents knew what that meant for them. But we also had intel coming out of the White House that the Taliban wanted to use these girls essentially as wanted to traffic them to their fighters as wives. So in those parts of the world and that type of culture, women and girls are commodities. And the way that the Taliban viewed it was they could give their fighters one of these girls, essentially part of their compensation package, right? It's like, we give you some food, give you a place to stay, give you a couple of wives, right? I mean, that's just the way it is over there. And these very young girls, they're not going to be given to 20-year-old men. No, they're going to be given to the 60-year-old men, 70-year-old men, right? I mean, this is the life that they're staring down the barrel of.
Oh my gosh.
So they panicked. They burned their passports, burned their soccer jerseys, right? Because women aren't allowed to play sport under the Taliban culture. So they pulled the hijabs or actually full burqas out of mothballs and tried to look the part. And that ended up causing some problems later, which we'll get into, of them not having any type of documentation. So then we got asked to bring these girls out. Yes, we'll do this. It's just another group of people we have to get out. It's a larger group, but we know how to split them up and compartmentalize them and put them into different groups. And so it was not really a problem. And then the first night that we put them into the mechanism, and we're moving them all at night, right? Mm-hmm. So the first night we put them into the mechanism, as we are moving them towards Eagle Base, they start contacting us and telling us that they're hearing a lot of gunfire and a lot of gunshots. Well, we find out later that the CIA operators and the JSOC operators at Eagle Base actually ended up in a firefight with the Taliban. So they shut down that night. So that was failed attempt number one. And this is the first failed attempt we had. Then the next day, the bombs went off at the gates. And that changed everything. So the U.S. protective posture went from a high level of protective posture to essentially a hunker down protective posture. And the administration made the decision to pull everybody into the airport. Nobody told us that. We didn't know. So we have our own friends and relationships. Some of them were, people who are still operators in the U.S. government who we were in contact with on the ground, and all of a sudden we couldn't get a hold of them either. So we end up moving the girls out. We moved them to their rally points, and we've got them all broken up. And it's important to understand that we were operating under the assumption that these different groups of girls, one of them at least would be compromised and captured by the Taliban, and the Taliban will torture them. They have no problem doing that. So we know this from all of our time, years on the ground in Afghanistan. So we compartmentalize them to the point that if one group got captured, they couldn't say anything about the other groups because they didn't actually know. They knew they existed, but they didn't know what it was they were doing or where they were going. So nobody knew. And we didn't tell anybody. These girls didn't know where they were going at any time. All they knew was they were to go to this point and stay there and wait for further direction. So we're moving them, leapfrogging them kind of one group at a time. And then we start getting them closer to Eagle Base. We can't get a hold of our contacts at Eagle Base, so we find places for them to hunker down. And then that's when the real interesting stuff started happening. So they said that they started hearing gunfire because keep in mind, we can't get in touch with our U.S. representatives on the ground in Kabul because they were turned out in the middle of a firefight and they had just gotten orders to destroy the base. Well, we didn't know they'd gotten orders to destroy Eagle Base. So we're getting intel from the girls that they see this massive fire on the horizon and they're hearing gunfire. And then the Taliban started moving around the base looking for other people, because at this point I think the Taliban had figured out, the Haqqanis really had figured out that people were being evacuated through Eagle Base, which is the whole reason why they ended up attacking. So the girls kind of had to think on their feet. In fact, at one point, the Taliban came up and asked them what they were doing, and I'll never forget it. It was so smart. One of the mothers told everybody, all the women, because this is all women and girls primarily, told them all to start crying. Well, no man wants to deal with a group of crying women, right? So that's super smart. The Taliban's like, what are you doing here? Like, oh, we're waiting for the funeral procession of our friends who died in the bombing. So it's brilliant, just thinking off the cuff, right?
Yeah, nice.
So the Taliban was like, oh, okay, like we're out of here. We don't want to deal with this.
What time was this during nighttime for them?
This
or
is
during
all
the
night.
Day?
This is all night.
Okay, yeah. And also, just to give context, how big is Kabul? Like, is it a major metropolitan city? Is it kind of like...
It's a major metropolitan developing world.
Developing world, yep.
And that's important because from a population perspective, it's extremely dense. Extremely dense, right?
Yeah.
This is not New York City. Everybody's got at least a couple hundred square feet of personal space. No, this is 12 people packed into 150 square feet of space.
Yeah, everyone's stacked on top of each other, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so the population density of Kabul is the footprint, the physical footprint of Kabul is actually not that big. You can get across it pretty quick. And where Eagle Base is actually, I'm trying to remember, it's about a 30-minute-ish drive. Anyway, so the girls then basically were informing us of what was going on. We finally get in touch with some U.S. folks, and they're like, no, we got orders to destroy the base. We're blowing up the base. We evac'd. We're actually all at the airport. Failure number 2 with these girls. So we sent them all home. Don't want them out during the day. We sent them home and said, hey, we'll get this figured out. So we spent the whole next day trying to figure out, and keep in mind, Zach wasn't in on this yet. This is just Bailey and I. You know, Bailey, Brent, and I are the ones basically doing this.
From Whitefish. And you're communicating with these girls in Afghanistan.
No, I'm communicating with Farkunda in Toronto.
And who is Farkunda?
Farkunda was the captain of this girls' team. She's absolutely heroic with the things that she did. So I'm communicating with her. She's in Toronto because I don't speak Farsi. And then she is communicating with the girls, and I'm giving her direction on how to break them up, what to say, what not to say, how to keep them calm. And so we're basically managing assets remotely through an interpreter in another country that I've never met. I've still never met Farkunda in person.
I haven't either. Yeah.
Bailey has.
Huh.
Yeah.
Nice.
She's like as close as a sister at this point.
Yeah.
But still never actually met her in person.
How are you guys communicating? Through apps? Through
WhatsApp and Signal. And
through
cell
WhatsApp
phone.
and Signal.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, that's pretty much it. So we have all these different pieces moving. We have all these different pieces going on. Now, Farkunda doesn't know who I am. She knows my name is Nic. She does not know that I am Nic McKinley. She doesn't know my background. I'm the only person in the team that she's communicated with. So all these folks at the White House, Robert, who's a former Special Forces guy who's working with us, Bailey, all this like team of people, she just thinks I'm the only person. We compartmentalize things so much because we also don't know who she really is. She's a Afghan Canadian, primarily Canadian. She, I think, lived in Afghanistan for just a very, very short period of time when she was young. So we don't really know who she is. Like we're basically operating off of a model of distrust, which means that things have to be highly compartmentalized because you have to assume that a part of the mechanism will be compromised at any point. And so she's just taking orders from some random dude in America who's telling her what to do. And then you have these girls on the ground in Afghanistan who know her, but they don't know her really well. And who are taking orders from her, being told to move around the city of Kabul at night. So put yourself in those girls' shoes. Imagine the desperation you would have to feel to have, as a father of a daughter, to get a random phone call from somebody that you've met a couple of times and then move across a war zone with your daughter in order to try to get out of the country. Like, that's how desperate these people were. So back to this, the failed night, right? Eagle Base burns. We send them all back home and we say, we're going to try again tomorrow night, and we're going to try to take you through the airport. So we take them to the airport the first night and can't get them in, even though we're talking to people on the ground in Kabul. Total chaos. Can't bring them in. Then then the sun's starting to come up. We send them all home. Then the next day, a former Special Forces guy from another organization, I don't know exactly what happened, but there was something to do with him bringing a bus of orphans into the base. And keep in mind that the U.S. base commander's first priority is to protect his troops, not the Afghans, right? He's got to protect his troops. And that's the right decision. That's the right thing to do. And so he wasn't doing anything wrong there. And when this former Special Forces guy, who's a relatively famous guy, used his influence essentially to get some guys on the ground to do some stuff for him, the base commander was like, lock down all the gates. This will not stand. And that was the right move. It really was. If I was him, I would like to think I would have done the same thing. So they locked down all the gates. Nobody knows that yet, right? So they put a gag order on the troops. They lock down the gates. Now we lose our communication directly with the ground in Kabul in the airport. Now we have to go through official channels. So that made things, because now agendas get involved. So that made things a lot more complicated. So the third night, we try to take them out through the airport. That fails. So we take them back the fourth night, and there was only one. There's a gate called Black Gate, and if you've operated the special intelligence operations, you understand what that means. And so Black Gate was the only gate that was actually receiving people. Now, Black Gate, you can't approach it on a vehicle because obviously the U.S. troops are worried about vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, so car bombs. So we're worried about suicide car bombs. So we can't have them approach it in a vehicle because troops will just shoot them up. So we have to have them approach on foot at night. Well, I mean, one of these women is pregnant, right? Is the mom of one of the girls. And this is another important piece when we decided that we would evac the girls. Part of the reason we were asked to do that was because of our expertise in human trafficking. You can't send these girls to a foreign country as teenage girls by themselves. They'll just end up being exploited and abused and trafficked. So we had to make sure we sent a authority figure, right? A parent, a grandparent, somebody with them. Well, so one of the women was pregnant. It was the mom of one of the teenage girls. And we've got her moving through the foothills right outside of Kandahar on foot through like ditches, trying to make her way to the base. And we're giving directions, because you can't say, hey, Afghan national, go to the Black Gate. They don't know what the Black Gate is. That's the whole purpose of having a Black Gate. So they don't even know that there's a gate there, most of them. So we ended up walking all these people in. They're out in a field just wondering what the heck is going on. And we're getting direction from somebody in D.C. We're not entirely sure exactly who that is, but we know that they have eyes on our people because they're telling them to get back farther and things like that. And then the sun starts coming up, and we got to get these girls away from the base because the Taliban, basically the U.S. government's cooperating way too much with the Taliban. Instead of just laying down the law and saying, hey, here's how things are, you give us a perimeter or we're going to shoot you in the face, which is what they should have done. Instead, there was all this like namby-pamby diplomatic stuff that just doesn't work. One, it doesn't work with a culture like that, and two, it doesn't work in that type of environment. So we had to get these girls out of view, so that these families out of view, so that the Taliban wouldn't discover them. So as the sun starts coming up, now keep in mind, this is fail number 4. right? We get them out. We take them to this gas station, which was a rallying point for coming in another gate that the military was saying that they would open back up. Well, we weren't the only group of people. That turned out there was hundreds of people who showed up at this gas station, hundreds. And then, so we managed to get a bus, and we managed to get a bus to kind of stack these girls in to kind of keep them out of view. And we parked it in a neighborhood a little while away. And then the bus driver turned out had a friend in that he knew, some government official inside the airport, and managed to broker for him and his family, and grabbed his family, walked out of the bus, and left all those girls by themselves, and basically was like, I got mine, I'm out. And so now we have a bus, but
no driver,
and he took the keys with him.
What?
Yeah. So we started
intentionally, or who knows?
Who knows? Maybe it was habit. I don't know. I mean, super chaotic. I'd like to think I wouldn't have done the same thing he did, but yeah, he left them all. So we then moved the girls to. We finally got in touch with the people in the Kabul airport, and they said, all right, move the girls to this point outside the gate where we can see them. And then what they would do is they would bring them in one at a time and have them make sure there's no bombs strapped to them or anything like that, and go through their backpacks and whatnot, and then let them into the gate. So we had that all coordinated. We started moving the groups of girls to this rally point where the U.S. soldiers could put eyes on them. And keep in mind, this is the middle of the day, so this is ridiculously hot. They're out in the sun, no shade, no water. They've got young girls, some of them babies with them, pregnant women. I mean, this is absolute dumpster fire. And the girls are out there, and they're just sitting there watching and watching and watching. And then they're telling us that there are people coming inside the gate. And our folks on the ground that we were communicating with were like, no, there's no people allowed in the gate. What had happened is some of the wealthier Afghans were bribing the Taliban to allow them through their checkpoint into the gate. And at that point, the U.S. commander said, no more, we're out. And so that is essentially, that is fail number 4, but that was about 16 hours of them dealing with this. Now, keep in mind, at this point, we've been operating for probably about 10 days, and I've maybe slept 2 hours a night, like cumulative. I mean, I am burnt. So it becomes clear, and then at that point, it becomes clear that we are not going to get anybody out through the Kabul airport because the U.S. coalition completely left. We were working with the Qataris to try to put pressure on the Haqqanis. The Qataris were trying to take over the airport from the Taliban because the Taliban doesn't have the ability to run an international airport. So the Qataris were lobbying for that contract. So they're not interested about a bunch of soccer girls. So that didn't work. And there's a difference in Taliban. When we say the Taliban, there's a very broad stroke. It's like saying Democrat or Republican, right? I mean, there's a lot of nuance there. And so there's really 2 factions of the Taliban. There's the what I call the Northern Taliban, which is your kind of more reasonable Taliban. It's the Taliban that we remember from or when we first went into Afghanistan. That's the Mullah Omar Taliban. And then there's the Haqqanis, and the Haqqanis are some brutal humans, right? I mean, they have their own like hit teams in the Khorasan crew, and there's some bad dudes. And the Haqqanis were the Taliban that took over Kabul. The Haqqanis are the reason why the Taliban was able to essentially steamroll the Afghan troops. So we cannot turn these girls over to the Kabul airport because the Haqqanis will just scoop them up and then, give them to their fighters. So we sent them home, and it was like, hey, go home. We're going to figure something out. And at this point, we kind of knew that this was going to be a problem and this was going to be a long haul, but I didn't know how. I didn't think it would last for months and months and months. But I knew that there was a couple of things that we needed to deal with. And one was we needed to get cash in the hands of the girls, and we need to figure out how to pay for things on the ground in Afghanistan as fast as possible. So within Sharia law and Islamic finance, there's this concept called a hawala. It's a probably 2,000+ year old, essentially money wire service, and very familiar with how this system works. And so we managed to, I'm going to be very careful what I say because of U.S. finance laws and things, but we managed to essentially create our own hawala so that we could pay for things on the ground in Afghanistan without ever having money punch a U.S. border. Working with U.S. entities and then other Western entities in other countries. So we started moving some money around. Now at the same time, I've got to figure out how to pay for all of this because I don't have the personal resources to do this, and this isn't Deliver Fund's mission. And by the total grace of God, this I don't know if he's a billionaire, but he's definitely a multi-hundred millionaire, kind of came out of nowhere and said, you guys seem to be the only ones who know what you're doing. Just whatever your costs are, I'll cover it. So that really changed things. And then Occidental Petroleum, which is a large petroleum company, came out and gave us a couple $100,000 and said, here, use this for whatever you need to get these girls out. So, okay, now I've got some capital.
Yeah.
Now we can actually start working. So we managed to get the equivalent of $50 into the hands of every person in our group. So they have a little bit of spending cash, because in these types of environments, cash becomes a real problem.
Right.
All the banks were closed. The Taliban is on the terrorist watch list and they're sanctioned. So you can't do business directly with the Taliban. There's all these finance rules that if you break them, you're potentially committing a felony. I'm not interested in doing that. So trying to solve these types of problems were really the crux of all of this. And this is what we were working on while these girls are sleeping. It's daylight here. Well, then as they start to wake up, we start getting these panic text messages. Farkunda does, and she's calling us saying, hey, the girls say the Taliban are going door to door looking for young girls and also looking specifically for them. And when they find young girls, they're either pulling them directly out of the house or they're marking the house so they can come back later and pick them up. And at that point, we were like, okay, execute. And so we had told them that they were supposed to take the absolute bare minimum essentials, whatever they needed to fit in a small book bag that looked like a student's book bag. And they were to have that bag with them at all times, use it as a pillow while they slept. And they were to be ready to leave their houses. So what we did was we basically figured out which family had the biggest house, and then we consolidated families in these groups. And I think we had 5 or 6 different groups because we compartmentalized these girls. And then we had different rally points pre-established. They didn't know where they were, but we had these rally point plans established so that as soon as we said execute, Farkunda knew, have group 1 go to point A. And then we would have a time delay. Group 2 goes to point B. Time delay. Group 3 goes to, point C, and so on and so on. So I told Farkunda, I was like, all right, execute. And at that point, I'd established some relationships with 2 different transportation providers in Kabul, and I had a mechanism to pay their invoices without breaking any U.S. finance laws or sanctions. And so we had 6 small buses. So about 20 passenger buses, and those buses all went to the different rally points and picked the girls up. Now, if you know Afghans, they will figure out how to make a Model T run for 100 years. I mean, they will fix duct tape, baling wire, they take redneck engineering to a whole new level. So I had no idea what kind of condition these buses were in, but I could make some pretty educated guesses. So I had established a relationship with a secondary bus company that had 50 passenger buses. But I don't want to break these girls into just 2 groups. I don't want to lose half of my mission if there's some type of compromise. So what we did was we had the 6 different buses, and then a couple hours later, we had the 2 50 passenger buses empty, follow behind them. In case somebody broke down on the side of the road, they would just be there for a couple hours and then they can move on. So I start getting all this, waking all these people up, getting everything moving. And then girls are getting picked up by the buses, and we're moving them to, we're just moving them north. We don't know exactly where yet. I'm just wanting them to move north. And they start moving, and I start getting the calls back that, hey, bus A is already on the highway. And like, we're going to use the term highway very loosely here, right? The route from Kabul to Mazar-e Sharif or to the Tajik border at Friendship Bridge or Uzbek border is it's like ranch roads.
Is it sort of like the North Fork?
Yes.
That'd be a good
That's
comparison.
Good comparison, right? North Fork on a good day.
Yeah.
Right.
After it's been oiled.
Yeah. It's rough. So I'm like, I have no idea what the plan is from here. I just know that the immediate problem we have to solve is to get these girls out of danger of the Haqqanis and get them moving north, because it's very clear at this point that anything that happens is gonna happen out of the north. And if you're going to move these girls, it's going to be into Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Turkmenistan. It's going to be into one of those countries, and so may as well get them headed that direction, or they're going to be a lot safer.
And I guess, was there just like a lot of people already trying to flee that way too?
Not really.
Or was it pretty quiet?
A lot of people at this point, I think, this gets into kind of a bigger issue around people claiming they have capabilities. They don't. A lot of people thought they were still going to be able to get out of the Kabul airport, but once we saw that Shiraz Haqqani essentially became the number 2 in charge of the Taliban, at that point it was like, okay, well, this is like, I know, like, Shiraz Haqqani was finding and taking action against Shiraz Haqqani was really one of my last taskings with the U.S. government. We obviously failed miserably, but so I understood who Shiraz Haqqani was very, very well, and he is a very, very smart, ruthless but very smart person. I was like, okay, like, we're not going to pull off something underneath this guy's nose and his people's nose. So now he can't control all of Afghanistan. That's kind of been the problem with Afghanistan since the beginning of time. So we knew, okay, let's get into an area where we've got some more reasonable people to deal with, and that's going to be in the north, which is traditionally the Northern Alliance territory. So we started moving them north, and at one point we had this real kind of breath hold moment where the Taliban, one of the girls had called Farkunda and just left her phone open, and Farkunda could hear what was going on, and the Taliban actually pulled the girls and their families off the buses and started searching them and questioning them. And I was like, okay, this is the compromise I was expecting. We figured I figured I would lose 1 to 2 buses at minimum. I'm like, okay, like, this is sad, and this is what we expected. And somehow, by the absolute grace of God, the Taliban let them go. They got back on the bus, and they're like, okay, we're headed back north. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is absolutely unbelievable. So we have all 6 buses en route. All 6 buses are apparently doing just fine. And a little bit before this, I realized, like I said, that I was exhausted at this point. I had very little food, almost no sleep. Emotionally, the ups and downs, the roller coasters were super intense, and I have no control. I have no ability to order anybody in any of this to do anything. All I have is the ability to say, hey, will you please help? Hey, can I pay you to do X, Y, or Z? And so I'm pretty crushed, and I'm very familiar with that, with my time in special ops and my time at the CIA. I've been here before, and so I knew I needed to find somebody to back me up. So I started making a bunch of phone calls and sending out emails, and one of them was a retired SEAL here in the Valley who said, I can't help, but I know somebody who I think can. He's a recently retired 25-year Navy SEAL named Zack Armstrong. I'm like, never heard of her. and so I started asking around, and some other SEALs I knew, and they're like, "Oh yeah, good dude." So in fact, one guy actually said his work will speak for him. And I was like, okay, that's all I need to know. So then enter Zack. So I've got 6 buses en route to Mazar-e Sharif, and they'd probably been on the road for about 30 minutes or so. And Zack comes in and was like, "What do you need me to do?" And we'd kind of gotten to know each other and figured out we had some people in the same. We knew some of the same people. And Zack ran the West Coast Air Project for the SEAL teams, basically. And so I'm like, "Oh, cool. This is a guy who knows his way around aircraft and knows his way around aircraft logistics. Welcome to the team. Here's your contract." And I think you're going to leave in the office like 6 hours later.
Yeah, I mean, just to provide some context, right? As I had just retired earlier that summer, and I was having a pretty hard time dealing with the way that we were executing the, retrograde of Afghanistan, right? Having lost so many friends there over the years and fought there, myself. So I was having a fairly hard time watching that go down over news and the TV and stuff, and had kind of expressed that to some folks and said, "Hey, if you hear of a way that I can help or anyone can help, like, let me know," right? And I want to say it was September 1st, maybe even the 31st. And I was walking the dog that morning and got a random email that said, "Hey, someone's looking for some help. Here's a phone number."
Right.
So I said, well, maybe, right? Like, maybe I don't know if I can help or not. Like, let me figure this out. And so I called, and it was Nick, and I could tell just from his tone over the phone that he was like running 100 miles an hour, like you said, without sleep. I could just tell that this had been an ongoing thing that this guy had been dealing with, and was looking for someone to just kind of step in and be able to assist in any way, right?
And just monitor the comms,
yeah,
so that I can go sleep. And I don't have to teach to monitor the comms. Like, I just need a couple hours of sleep.
Yeah,
right? I need a shower. I stink at this point.
And did you guys have other contacts? Because I'm just thinking what it would take to orchestrate moving 300 people here. And it seems like, did you have contacts or resources in Afghanistan from, I'm guessing, your time there? Because
combination of past relationships and straight up freaking guardian angels coming out of nowhere.
Oh yeah.
And luck and divine intervention and everything else on top of that, right? So it wasn't just us, right? It was Claire Russo, who is really the heroine of the whole Afghan withdrawal. I mean, she is. It is hard to overstate her importance in the Afghan withdrawal.
Now, who's Claire?
Claire is she works for USAID. She's in charge of essentially violence against women issues or something like that around USAID. Johnny Walsh, Samantha Powers, Allie with Senator Coon's office. I mean, this is a pretty robust but very, very dynamic team of people, all of whom have no authority over anybody else. It is literally just a bunch of people coming together to do the right thing and rowing in the right direction. And they kind of gave de facto leadership to us, handed it over because they're like, you guys, right? Former PJ, former SEAL, you guys probably know more what you're doing than we do. We'll take direction from you. And that was pretty big of them. Pretty big.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, like I said, I didn't know whether I could help or not, but it was like mid-morning, and I said, hey, maybe I could swing by and I can see if I can contribute in some way. And he's like, all right, I think it was like 1:00. Come by at 1 at this address. And I came by. I think I walked out of here. Yeah, 6 hours later. Yeah. And I was just like, here we go. Yeah. And he introduced me to that whole team that he just mentioned, and a couple others, and really those people were incredibly instrumental in. I mean, that's even though we were the ones that were kind of managing these are the people that we're reaching out to when we need assistance, getting in touch with a litany of other entities and government organizations and officials, right? Like,
because we could pull unofficial levers, but we can't pull official diplomatic levers. Only the government can. And so they were willing to kind of do those pieces for us.
Wow.
Yeah. So Zack walks in and essentially says, all right, I'm in, how can I help? And, with Zack's experience, I don't have to train him in much. It was his first experience understanding how frustrating things can be to get things done in the civilian world. But other than that, I don't have to train him in anything. I'm like, all right, here's what we're doing. And I don't care if you're a SEAL, a PJ, CIA, it doesn't matter. If you're in special ops, you know how to identify a problem, rally around a problem, figure out plan A through Z, and start executing. Right? It's that simple, right? It's not that simple in execution, but when you have that 25 years of experience in special ops, it's kind of that simple. So Zack was like, all right, they're on their way to, I was like, where are they going? I was like, well, Friendship Bridge in Uzbekistan, which is the bridge that goes from Afghanistan to Uzbekistan. If that doesn't work, then we're going to push them to Tajikistan. And if that doesn't work, then we'll figure something out. And he was like, okay, how are they getting across the bridge? I was like, I don't know, but they got about 8 hours left on the road. We got 8 hours to figure it out. and that's what we did.
And you're funding like the gas for the buses,
everything, the
crazy.
The people, the food, the water,
yeah,
everything. And so, but that's okay because we already created our own little hawala.
Right.
Not a real hawala. IRS agents listening to this, it's not a real hawala, but it's kind of a hawala, right? So we push them up to the border, and now the bus drivers of the 6 buses, keep in mind they left their families in Kabul. So there is no incentivizing them to stay there. We offered to double their pay, triple their pay. They were like, no, they need to get back to their wife and kids. Totally understand that, right? It probably would do the same thing. And so the 2 bus backup convoy that we had, the 50 passenger buses, catches up to the 6 passenger buses. And this guy named Ray, who I'm pretty sure is like an angel from heaven.
Oh my gosh.
That guy was absolutely phenomenal. He's the one who owned the company that had those buses. So that night or that day, we get them to Uzbekistan. It's starting to get dark. The Uzbeks are like, absolutely not. Nobody's coming across this bridge. And it's important to understand, to the defense of the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Turkmens, they see, these are very impoverished, pretty poor countries. So they don't see a bunch of refugees. They see a bunch of very expensive problems. And not only that, but how many of those problems are wearing bombs coming into their country? There's no way for them to sift through that if all of a sudden they open the gates to the bridge and there's just a mass sea of people that come across, right? So they're trying to look out for their own country, as they should be. So the Uzbeks said no, so we pushed them to the Tajik border. They get to the Tajik border right as the sun is going down. The Tajiks are like, absolutely not. And it's a really bad idea to move across to Afghanistan in 50 passenger buses in the middle of the night. So those women and girls all slept in those buses that night. And then the next day, and now they have no water, no food. They're literally just sleeping in buses in the middle of nowhere. And the bus drivers have not gotten paid. So this is all on a promise from Ray, who's an Afghan American. Ray is not his real name. And Ray is actually here in the States. He eventually went back over to Uzbekistan and started coordinating, but he's here in the States, and he's got a brother or cousin or somebody who was a family member who was on the ground as his trusted agent on the ground. So this is all kind of being done on a handshake deal right now. And so as the sun came back up, we were talking to him, and it was like, Ray, he got any ideas? Like, what's your cousin saying? He's like, well, let's move him to Mazar. I was like, roger that. Let's move him to Mazar. We don't have any better plans.
No, not at all. We were at that point.
So we knew that the Taliban, right, there's a rift going on. And so we're staying on top of what's going on with the Taliban. There's a rift going on between the southern Taliban, the Haqqanis, and the northern Taliban, which is your ISI, Pakistani-controlled Taliban. And the Qataris are controlling the Haqqanis, and the Pakistanis are controlling the northern Taliban, and the Pakistanis and the Qataris have a beef. So they're essentially in a little bit of a proxy war using the Taliban forces against each other because everybody wants to control the trade routes out of Afghanistan that they all know is coming, because China is going to come mine everything, and the Chinese are already working in this. So this is geopolitical chess, like 3D chess in space with a spinning chessboard. All these different pieces are all getting moved around. So we're staying on top of what's going on with the Taliban, but we knew that the Taliban was not incentivized to harm these girls. The Northern Taliban wasn't, and that they were probably too distracted keeping the Haqqanis, and then there was a resistance forming at the same time with this old general named the Lion of Panjshir. His son was starting to form a resistance, kind of a new Northern alliance against the Taliban. So the Northern Taliban was busy dealing with that. So we knew we could slip these buses in to Mazar probably relatively unnoticed. So we got them in, and then they managed to negotiate using a couple of warehouses, one for the men and one for the women, in order to, because we had some fathers and sons and things like that were in the group. And so we used these two warehouses to essentially house these women and girls for a while before we could get them into some better quarters in what was essentially an apartment complex or hotel. So again, some more divine intervention. It just so happens to be that there is a Afghan woman who lives in the northwestern United States, whose family is from Mazar-e-Sharif, and she is a minority tribe Christian Afghan. So, and I'm purposely being vague about the details here, right, to protect her identity and her family's identity. So she was able to make the drive to come into the office and be a backup translator, because I still don't know if I can trust Farkhunda. I need somebody I can trust who's telling me whether or not Farkhunda's properly translating these things. And I got all these messages coming in from these girls in Farsi, because we got phones everywhere, because we've even compartmentalized the communications, because we don't know who's got what capabilities overseas. So we've got all this going on, and she comes in, and then her family, we were able to hire her extended family on the ground in Mazar to feed and clothe and take care of these girls it was like $30 a head per night. It was super cheap, but those times over 300. So it was actually really expensive.
Yeah.
And the bills were stacking up really fast, which was stressing me out. And so we get them into the warehouses, and at this point we kind of have the problem of food, water, and shelter for these girls figured out, and that's when the real chaos started.
Well, that was just our opportunity to reset, right? Like we just needed to.
That was to take a breath, get a shower.
I mean, these people had been on these buses for, at this point it was approaching like 4 days. Yeah, it was an extended period of time, right? And so we just needed to be able to food, water, and shelter so that we could reset on our end, because the ground option clearly wasn't going to be as easy as we thought it was going to be.
Yep. So everyone just kind of took 5, the girls were able to chill there for a minute, not worry. They're not in a super dangerous area. Like, what was the vibe of that city?
It was non-permissive.
Okay.
So, which is just a kind of a fancy way of saying it's not a combat zone, but you don't want to be caught on the street.
Yep.
And in fact, one of our biggest problems was trying to keep these 14-year-old girls from going outside and kicking a soccer ball.
Because they've been on a bus for 4 days. They're just probably getting antsy.
Well, and at this point, I mean, you got to keep in mind, so Freedom Bridge was failure number 5. The Tajik Bridge was failure number 6. So they've been bouncing literally all over their country with nothing but some promises that some people are trying their best, and every single time is a failure. So put yourself in their psychological state at that point.
Yeah.
So at least at this point, they have food, water, and shelter. Good food, good water. They're able to get showers themselves. They're able to launder and change their clothes. They're able to be human. And so then we went and slept. We went and
we took a breath too.
Yeah.
We took a beat and then came back and said, okay, what are we going to do? So some backstory on this. When this all happened, the company Slack, your communications company, they offered to start a Slack channel to kind of coordinate all the people like us that came, like old guys out of mothballs that were all trying to help. So Deliver Fund was the 501c3 sponsor of that channel, which eventually became known as a Digital Dunkirk. There was over 4,000 people on it at one point. And when there was only 400, it was useful. When it got to be 4,000, it became unuseful. It actually kind of became a distraction. So we disengaged from that and started putting together our own plans. And we had probably 25 different options on the board.
We looked at every option.
Yeah, for what we were going to do. And we're talking everything from reaching in my old days and working with oligarch arms dealers and, gray market people and mercenaries and foreign governments. And there was nothing that was off the table. If it was legal, it was on the table. And we started
chasing leads.
Yeah, we just started chasing leads. And the reason I say that's when the real chaos started was because, unfortunately, there was a lot of people that were claiming capability they didn't have.
Oh, 100%. So Nic had just talked about we started chasing these leads, right? Because once we got the girls, everyone into a safe place, water, feed, we needed to kind of reset and reevaluate what our options were, knowing that the land options were either impossible or difficult at best, right? And so we started developing and chasing a lot of our own leads. The problem was, and this is what Nic was referring to as chaos that ensued, right, is by this point there was a lot of rumors of different organizations and people with capabilities that didn't necessarily exist. But if you would just wire them the money, then they could pull it off.
Unfortunately, a lot of old special ops guys tried to come out of mothballs to be relevant to this. And instead of just coming in and say, hey, how can I help? It was more of the number of rumors we heard about how, if you just wire me $500,000, I can get a helicopter on a black LZ in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan. And
at this point, we're all looking at the same maps. We're all getting the same intel feeds regarding the, how things are continuing to progress post-collapse, right? And so when people are talking about black LZs in Afghanistan, it's like, well, where is that? Because we're familiar with the maps too. And there's some really small places that's going to even be a possibility. Right?
What is an LZ?
A landing zone, landing strip, right? So a
dirt runway, dirt helipad out in the middle of nowhere. And Let's keep in mind too, all it takes to deny an LZ is one dude with a rifle. It's not exactly expensive to make an LZ off limits. And this is not a combatant evacuation, so it's not like we can call on JSOC to bring in gunships.
Right.
So it was.
Yeah. So it's just in any kind of unimproved dirt airstrip that would be in any area, they're going to know about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the chances of them already monitoring those places for things like that were exceptionally high, and so having experienced failed attempts of getting them across the border, we were looking at river crossings, we were looking at all sorts of different options to get them out of the country in order to be able to move them on, right? And again, it all came back to if you just wire us the money. And so when we really started diving into going down some rabbit holes with a few of these other NGOs, it would always stop at OPSEC. Well, I can't tell you how we're going to pull that off. Well, no one was moving anyone anywhere, right? But everyone just claimed that they had that capability at the drop of a hat. And so it became incredibly difficult and consumed a lot of our time to start to wade through who was legit and who wasn't.
And we say a lot of time. We lost a good 7 days.
Yeah, we
trying to figure this out.
And part of a week trying to understand like who was full of it and who actually had some sort of relevant capability that could potentially contribute to mission success for us, right?
And I was I'm on the phone with kind of the gray side of things, and Zach's on the phone with everybody from senatorial staffers to congressmen to White House appointees, and I'm on the phone simultaneously with the CEO of the Tajik National Airline and the CEO of one of the largest arms manufacturers in the world, and we're trying to bring like that. That's the level, and also dealing with like Hollywood A-list actors who are not only helping with money but helping with their connections. I mean, these are names that people would know right off the top of their head, and they were doing everything they could to try to spin up foreign governments and the U.S. government and trying to get people involved. And so these are all parallel efforts that are happening at the same time. And then Zach and I would come together and compare notes and be like, okay, well, this person's saying these things and that's contradictory, so that's false, and like we just started trying to have to filter everything until we could figure out what was real.
Wow.
And then we finally did. So then we finally figured out what was real. And
we think we did. Do we want to talk about how that key moment when that happened?
Yeah, let's go for it.
And Rudy?
Yeah.
Is that where
so
we're
there was a lot of circular reporting, and what it all came down to was there's only one aviation company that was allowed to fly in Afghanistan, and it's a company called Cam Air, right? Afghan National Airlines, the Taliban took that over, and they were using Afghan National Airlines to move their own people around, their fighters around, but it had nothing to do with like they couldn't punch outside of the Afghan borders. So the only airline that had any clearance by the Taliban to fly internationally and actually leave Afghanistan was Cam Air. Now, there's a problem with aircraft where you've got to have insurance on aircraft in order to fly them, and Cam Air their insurance company would only allow the Block 1 737s, which are like the Ford F-150s of 737s. They're cheap. They can pretty much go anywhere and survive anything, but they can't go very far, right? You can't fly. You can't fly across ponds with a Block 1 737. So we had Cam Air turned out was the only aviation company, but everybody in the world was claiming that they had access to planes. And we had capital and significant capital. So we said, every time somebody said that they had a capability, it's like, great, let's talk about it. How much is this going to cost? And what are the details? And we know how to do due diligence on this. And like Zach said, every time it just came down to, oh man, it's OPSEC, I can't tell you. What? Like, just wire me the money. It's, yeah, well, that's not how the law works. So you got to have a paper trail for everything. And I'm not wiring anybody anything unless I feel very, very confident that I'm going to get what it is that I needed. So I'm talking to this guy, Rudy, who's working on contract for one of Glenn Beck's organizations, Mercury One.
Glenn Beck, the media
Glenn
guy.
Beck, the media guy. Like that Glenn Beck.
Okay.
And he's working for him because Glenn Beck was really putting his money where his mouth was. He, I guess, was all over the media, saying this is a travesty and we need to do something to help these Afghans. But then he put, I don't know how much money, but significant amounts of money behind actually trying to do that and doing those types of things. And so Rudy was essentially the guy that got contracted to. He was the Nick and Zack in his team to get that done on behalf of Glenn Beck's organizations. So I get connected with him through another SOF guy that I knew from the Air Force, and Rudy was an Air Force pilot at JSOC, and so we eventually get connected, kind of do the handshake. Do we know each other? Do we trust each other? Okay, we know some of the same people, so you must be good enough. Hey, what do you got? And so Rudy and I would come together once a day and compare notes, and then kind of go back out and collect more information and come back and and compare notes. And then I never forget, I'd just woken up, I'd just gotten a shower. I got a call from, because at this point, Zach and I were on shifts. We figured out we were in it for the long haul, and so we were doing shift work now. And I'm talking to Rudy, and we both had this epiphany that the capabilities that Rudy had were being brokered to me through other NGOs who wouldn't tell me what they knew. And the capabilities that Rudy was being told about were his own capabilities that were being brokered circularly back to him.
Wow.
And we finally figured this out, and I was like, oh, I was like, dude, hold on, I got to call Zack. So I called Zack and I was like, hey, dude, so here's what's going on. We just figured this out. And so you would have thought there was 20 different air companies running in and out of Afghanistan. Turned out there was one, of which not a single flight had actually taken off yet because the Taliban hadn't given clearance. And keep in mind, if you want to keep a plane from flying, one dude with one AK solves that problem.
Right.
So Rudy was like the first moment of truth in over a week's worth of wading through, dead ends and vague conversations with other NGOs. Rudy was a moment of truth and all that. And as soon as that happened, we knew that we had made a solid connection with someone that was going to help us be able to advance our mission.
Wow.
Right. So at that point, we started working very closely with Rudy and passing contacts and whatnot back and forth. And we still are working the Tajik angle, the Turkmen angle, the Uzbek angle, the Pakistani angle. We're still working everywhere. Because one of my big problems and concerns was we couldn't have a bunch of young teenage girls that we send to a refugee camp where they'll just be abused and trafficked. We can't send them to some country where they're not going to be in an official status, where they'll just be abused and trafficked. Like, we have to get them an official status in a safe country, in a safe haven country. And that was a real problem. And that's where Claire and Johnny and kind of all the official U.S. government people at the White House came in to start pulling those diplomatic levers to get official status. Because you can have a handshake agreement with a foreign government, but if you don't have an actual piece of paper from them, that handshake agreement is absolutely worthless.
So maybe, and this just popped in my mind, but maybe talk about that AP story that that's what spurred a couple countries to stand up and kind of offer.
This PR woman out of Austin named Christine Haas, absolutely amazing. She put her entire company on the line to help with this effort. And in order to start putting some public pressure on some folks, she got some AP stories run. She got some stories run in People magazine. She really pulled out all the stops and got some serious media coverage
of the girls' situation.
Of the girls' situation.
As it's happening
in real time. And so Alex, I remember was the first name of one of the reporters at the AP, did a great story and really put a call to action in it about, hey, like, somebody's got to step up and help these girls. At this point, it was very clear it was not going to be the U.S. government. We got nothing but, and when I say the U.S. government, I don't mean to paint with too broad of a brush here. It was very clear it was not going to be the U.S. State Department. So the State Department was the problem in this entire thing, full stop. If you could have eliminated the State Department, if they just would have just not come to work that day, everything would have been so much better. And so despite the fact that there were other people within the government, within the military, the CIA, JSOC, SOCOM, USAID, who were doing absolutely heroic stuff, the State Department was essentially doing the opposite of what everybody else was doing. All right. It was like everybody else was trying to put, grease on the bowling lane, and the State Department was coming in and adding, rocks and concrete and sand. And so
by doing what? Like, were they just
actively stopping operations from happening, actively stopping evacuations from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And we have that dead to rights in writing.
Yeah.
So it's not our word against theirs. So anyway, as we started working all of these different things and we finally got to Rudy was a source of truth and we were a source of truth, and we started collaborating, then a mechanism really started to form of Cam Air agreed to get people out. We just needed to find a follow-on country for them to go to, and then we needed somebody to pressure the Taliban to give Cam Air flight clearance to take off. So instead of having 100 different problems, now we have 2 very significant big problems.
Yeah, big problems,
but
but
only 2.
But you have, okay, so just to recap, so you've got Cam Air signed on because of Glenn Beck.
Right. So
Wow, how does that work?
So Glenn Beck's organization had purchased blocks of flight time from Cam Air,
right?
In order
this was
to do
pre-collapse.
in order to do evacuations.
Pre-collapse, he had done that, right? So he still had a credit with them post-collapse.
Right. So he had credits with them. They were going to use those credits to evacuate people out of Kabul, and then when that was no longer an option, then everything shifted to Mazar. So Mazar-e-Sharif was really the only airport that was in play at this point for Afghans. Westerners could still get out through Kabul International Airport, right? And the government hadn't quite given the Taliban billions yet, so the Taliban was playing respectfully,
playing nice, gotcha.
Because they knew that there was some foreign aid coming down the pipe, and so everything for Afghans had pretty much shifted to Mazar. Now we got to Mazar, we were one of the first groups in Mazar. Of course, now Mazar is starting to get flooded with Afghans, which in some ways kind of was okay because it started to take the heat off of our people, and it started to become a distraction for the Northern Taliban. So figuring this out, we knew that, okay, we have two problems we have to solve. One is a very gray area. It's getting cooperation with the Taliban, because how do you do that without negotiating directly with the Taliban, because that would be illegal. And then two was find them a place, the girls a place to land, a destination country. So Zach and Claire and whatnot started working on that, and I started working on how do you get pressure on the Taliban. And because at this point, and to Glenn Beck's organization's credit, whether or not people like his politics or whatever, it doesn't matter. This is a true statement of fact. We were able to get in touch with his chief of security, who put us in direct touch with Glenn, and I was able to explain the situation and make the pitch to him that these girls needed to be prioritized out of the country, and he agreed. And so the first aircraft to leave Afghanistan was going to be his, and he gave us the second aircraft. Had he not agreed to do that, this would not have happened. So that was the first of two times that Glenn Beck became extremely useful in this whole thing. So we have credit. Glenn Beck essentially took a handshake deal with us. We agreed to reimburse him for the flight, and he agreed to give us the airplane. So now we have a paid for airplane. That's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. That can take over.
Yeah,
because it's a 737.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I mean, it can take well over 100 people. And keep in mind that all during this, some of the families and some of the Afghan soccer players were starting to wean off. They were losing faith. I don't blame them one bit.
Yeah,
they were losing faith, and they were starting to kind of say, "Hey, we're going to go to our friends in Kandahar. We're going to go back to Kabul, or we're going to take our chances on our own,
on their own,
trying to go across other borders." Like illegally cross other borders, and like I don't blame them. I don't say that from a place of judgment. They were losing faith, and that's okay. And so we ended up once we had the Cam Air deal done, then I started working on trying to get pressure on the Taliban, and Zach and his team at the White House started working on Portugal. There was actually a couple of different countries, but it really sifted out to Portugal. And once we were able to get in touch with some official representatives of Portugal, and we were able to kind of get outside of the official channels and, for lack of better terms, do some drug dealing with this foreign government, we were able to get an agreement that they would accept these girls. Okay, great. Now we have an agreement, which is worthless unless we have an official piece of paper. So then we had simultaneously, they had to go to their political people. Zach pushed that to our political people, and then the word started to make it up to the right people at the diplomatic level to say, to get paperwork exchanges and actually get this in writing, which took a little bit longer than we thought.
Yeah, I mean, I was working with various ministries of foreign affairs offices in several countries. Portugal, actually Georgia, oddly enough, and then to get all these
Albania.
Yeah, a bunch of different, countries to get them all talking at the official level in order to get the required paperwork, which consisted of several different levels, right?
And keep in mind, this is during COVID. So everybody's obviously worried about COVID still, all on top of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of people are working remotely and they're not in their normal offices and stuff, right? So just trying to coordinate those different entities to generate the paper that was required. They needed a note verbal that talked about, yes, we're willing to accept them. Then they needed an additional piece of paper that authorized it. And to collect all of those things, we kept running into different timelines on the airline side of things that would delay us. And then delay us again, or we'd miss a deadline, and because we didn't have this piece of paper, and then we'd get rolled again. Meanwhile, on the ground in Mazar, things were changing, not even by the day, but by the hour.
Yeah.
There would be talk of, by that time they had assigned a Ministry of Interior in Afghanistan.
They put Shiraz Haqqani in charge of it.
They did. And he actually, I think, went up to Mazar for a visit, and that shut down everything for almost a week or something.
Yeah.
It was 3 or 4 days right at a fairly critical time for us. Right. And so, just getting all the pieces lined up so that things would work was incredibly challenging, and we'd always get to almost the tipping point, and then something would happen and we'd have to reset. And a significant one, I have to go into the sidebar on Uzbek, but within, because I was reviewing some of our previous conversations, prior to this week, but within hours of us having a flight off the ground and routed through, we were gonna, it was a ferry to Uzbek. We were gonna cross-load passengers and then fly them on to Portugal. The U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan shut us down within 3 hours of wheels up. And
at this point, we've been working on this for 6 weeks.
Yeah, it was a really long time, right? And so this was the day after Blinken testified to Congress that State Department was not stifling veteran and NGO efforts to help get refugees out of the country. And so, my immediate reaction was, hey, this guy's either not paying attention to what his boss is saying in Washington, or it's a flat out lie. So regardless of
one of those two things is true.
Right. And within 3 hours of wheels up, we got shut down again, which cost us, it was about another week. Having to hide, feed water and house these girls and hope that in that time, the Taliban didn't catch on to where they were at, because at this point they were looking for them. The word was out that the youth women's soccer team was trying to get out of the country.
Because around the world.
The downside of putting out media to pressure a government, to pressure governments, is that you are also informing people. So this is something we talked about a lot. Do we do the media? Do we not do the media? In the end of the day, we decided that the juice was worth the squeeze, and it was worth the risk. So we allowed the media to go out. But I mean, where we come from, you don't say anything, right? You don't talk about Fight Club. So learning how to leverage the media for the purposes of getting something done was something I think both of us were extremely uncomfortable with, and we really had to rely on Claire and Johnny and Christine's expertise when they were saying, "Hey, this will be a good thing to get done." We're like, "Okay, like we've got no better options."
I remember we needed to pressure the international community for someone to host these girls. Because even though we had a plane lined up, right, it doesn't matter if we don't have anywhere to bring them.
Right. And they don't, and just to circle back, they don't have passports at this point either, because they burned them all.
Right. Well, that became the next of a smaller problem. They burned their passports. The Portuguese said, no problem, we don't really care. I'm sure their intelligence agencies were doing their own due diligence and all that stuff, right? Whatever they were doing, they're going to keep their country safe. And but the Taliban was saying that they were not going to allow anybody without documentation out of the country. So there was all kinds of rumors about black market passports and things like that, and that's all illegal. Like, we weren't even considering those types of things. And then it just dawned on me one day. I said, let's write a letter, put it on USAID letterhead, and get Johnny at USAID to authorize us to use his signature. And he said, okay. And then we had pictures of all of the girls. And I said, okay. So I said, Bailey, Bailey Brenton, who is really my one of my right hands at Deliver Fund. I said, Bailey, here's what I need you to do. And I walked her through how to create this document that looked very official and was kind of official, but not really, but kind of.
Yeah.
And I said, here's how you do it. Here's how you put it together. And then she made like 300 of those. These are all names in Farsi. I mean, the level of attention to detail that she had was unbelievable. Especially, she's been with us this entire time, so she's exhausted. And she created all these letters, which became known as Johnny letters. And we created them and just said, all right, fine, we're going to have these in case we need them. We have no better options for official paperwork, and the U.S. government won't issue official paperwork. And we tried to get the Portuguese to issue official paperwork, and they weren't willing to do that either. So we were like, well, let's do this. Let's put it on the shelf, and maybe we'll end up needing it. So we did that. We have the airplane figured out. Now we have to have a transit country. So we got all the right people talking to each other because Uzbek got shut down. The Uzbeks were great until the U.S. State Department came in and started shutting everything down. So ultimately, the parent company of Cam Air was a Ukrainian company, which obviously they have their own diplomatic connections. So they started leveraging those, and they got the Georgians to allow a transload because, again, that Block 1 737 can't really, the gas bags are super small and it can't really fly that far. And so, and also we had the problem of all the Western European countries were not going to allow an aircraft with an Afghan flagged tail to fly through their airspace.
Yeah.
And so
we had the lily pad somewhere.
Yeah. So the Azerbaijanis said, okay, you can fly across the Black Sea. The Turkmen said that they would accept the airplane in their airspace. The Azerbaijanis said that they would, and the Georgians said that they would. Well, that is a direct path to Tbilisi. So then we were able to transload. We set up a transload with a company called Ukrainian Wings, which is the parent company of Cam Air, I believe. And they agreed to facilitate a transload from a Block 1 737 to a Block 3 737, which had enough gas to get from Tbilisi direct to Lisbon, because no other country in between would allow a transit, would allow a lily pad. So, okay, now we have that problem solved. We think we have the paperwork problem solved, but we'll know that in real time. Either it's going to work or it's not.
Through the terminal, right?
Yeah. So now the last thing that we had to solve was how do we get the Taliban to allow transit?
Now, mind you, there still hasn't been a flight off the ground yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Nobody's gotten off the ground.
No one's flown post-collapse at this point.
Besides the military taking their
Besides
B2s
the military
out.
or the Emiratis or the Qataris, right? Besides the government.
So no civilian planes.
No private aircraft.
No, and we're approaching mid-September here, right? So a couple weeks.
Jeez.
And we've been working this 24/7, 365, no days off for
a month.
Well, over that, we're probably up to 6 weeks at this point, right? The timeline gets hard to.
But weeks.
It all
starts to
turn into
together.
one day.
It was one big day.
Yeah.
So we start working again, gray market connections, working with the Tajik president's office, and keep in mind that the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Turkmen, like, they don't all get along. They all tolerate each other, but they don't like each other, and they're not willing to really work with each other, and they don't want to help another country look good, and there's lots of geopolitical stuff going on. Plus there's probably treaties in negotiation that we have no idea about that are probably in play. There's probably foreign aid packages that are probably in play. Like, we have no idea about any of this stuff. So we start working through some contacts in Pakistan. I have years of my life on the ground in Pakistan, and we find out that Imran Khan, the president of Pakistan at the time, is a Glenn Beck fan.
Oh, what?
You cannot make this up. I'm like, wait a minute. So you're telling me the president of Pakistan, one, even knows who Glenn Beck is.
Yeah, we were shocked.
And 2 is a fan.
How did that revelation come up?
I don't want to get into details of who I was talking to, but it was a high level official somewhere in the Pakistani government who knows Imran very well.
Okay.
And because I have some rather significant Hollywood connections, I was trying to play that angle. Like, hey, I can get some of the biggest names to come like do a photo shoot with you, to freaking sing at your daughter's 16-year-old party. Like, I don't know, what do you want? And that's what he was like. If you could get to Glenn Beck, he just so happens to be a fan. Well, simultaneously, Rudy, he's Lebanese American. The guy speaks like 5 languages. I mean, he's a brilliant human, and one of the best people you would ever know. He was getting some intel through. I have no idea, and I'm not going to ask where he gets his stuff. He's an extremely capable man, but he was getting some of the same intel. Well, it just so happens to be that we have access to Glenn Beck, and Rudy has direct access to Glenn Beck. And so they got Glenn Beck, told him what was going on. I think he was probably even more surprised than anybody else.
Yeah, I think he talked about that.
Yeah. And so he wrote a letter to Imran Khan asking him for a personal favor. And that opened the floodgates to the Taliban. And the next thing you know, I will never forget this as long as I live, mainly because I was so exhausted. I was on my couch at home fighting off the sleep monster because I was on night shift at this point. I was pulling, comm shift. And I think at this point, Zach and I were so tired, we were taking 4-hour shifts.
I don't even remember.
Because we couldn't power through 12-hour shifts anymore.
No,
it was too much. So we'd broken it down to, I think we broke it down to 6-hour shifts.
6 seems
and
right.
that was starting to get to be too much, and then we broke it down even further. So I'm on my comm shift. It's at like 2 a.m. or something like that. And then I'm sitting there staring at my iPad and slamming Red Bulls and trying to stay awake, and I get this text that says wheels up in a couple hours from this Brit who worked for Cam Air, who's on the ground in Mazar, and he was our direct contact with the airline. And I'm looking at it like, am I honestly reading this? Okay. He says start moving your people to the airport. So we have this mechanism. It's already built. All we have to do is push the execute button, and I start calling Farkhunda. And keep in mind, I have a team. Farkhunda's by herself. And this whole time, she has been like walking the girls through yoga classes over WhatsApp video, trying to keep them calm, trying to keep their brains engaged. She just graduated college. She was a teacher. And so she's trying to actually teach them, and she's been keeping them on top of doing all the things that she's needed to do to help us and doing all the translation work. She was trying to keep these girls calm. So she finally hit the end of her rope, and she was asleep. And so I am blowing up her phone. I probably called her 50 times before she finally answered, trying to get her, because she is the only person who can directly contact the girls on the ground. Because what am I going to say in English?
Yeah.
So I finally get a hold of Farkhunda, and I'm like, Far, execute. And she was like, what? I'm like, execute. Get the girls moving to the airport now. So we start waking up the bus drivers, because those same 2 buses are still there.
Oh, okay.
So like Ray is a straight up hero. Those 2 buses and those drivers, they were there. They saw this through to mission execution, and they'd parked the buses, but then those drivers stayed because they were Afghan men, so they can move around relatively freely, and they were helping to coordinate logistics of food and water and care for these people, and kind of keep them all together. So like I would love to meet those men someday. Probably never will, but they did some heroic stuff. So they go and get the buses, bring them in, collect up the girls. We still got to move through Taliban checkpoints. We got to do all this stuff on the way. And I'm like, I'm getting ready for the absolute worst news. Because keep in mind, we don't have 6 elements anymore. We have 2. And they're traveling in a convoy because we're on a time fuse now. So if we get compromised, the whole package gets compromised. I mean, everything is done. So I'm expecting problems at Taliban checkpoints. I would at
we
this
weren't sure
point,
if they'd get to the terminal.
Yeah,
I mean,
so now we're moving our passengers. At this point, if you would have said, what's the probability of success, I would have told you 20%. Even with all the mechanism that we put together, everything that we went through, I would have said it was 20%. And Imran Khan is a very powerful man, because they didn't get anything but salutes as they went through freaking checkpoints.
Holy
right?
smokes.
Now, the Cam Air guy, we sent him all these letters that Bailey made. He prints them out and starts calling out names and giving them to the girls, and they get in a line. Now the Taliban needs to allow them into the. So okay, we got them to the terminal. Okay, so now we went from 20% probability to 40% probability of execution. But now you always the most risky part of any operation is when you're crossing a line of communication, right? A guarded line of communication. It's usually a border or something like that, right? And when you cross into a terminal, you're essentially crossing a border. So you are relying on, I don't care if you're working with presidents of countries, you're relying on the fact that information made it all the way down to lowest common denominator, standing at the desk in the airport.
who's checking all the paperwork?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
and we know this. I mean, the very first person who was ever killed at the CIA, the very first star on the wall, was a operative who moved across the Himalayas in mountains to get to Nepal to avoid Mao, and everything was worked out with the Dalai Lama and everybody. And then he got to the border and he was shot by a border guard because the word didn't make it down to the border guard. So like, we know this stuff because we've done these real world operations. We know that repatriation is extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
And it just so happened to be that word did make it all the way down to the lowest common denominator, manning the desk in the airport. And we started getting these pictures of the girls on an airplane. So now we're like, okay, still not out of the woods. We can see the tree line, but we're not out of the woods yet.
And all of them fit on that one plane.
Oh, yeah.
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 Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so
Were there other people in the airport? Like, was it?
not
no,
really.
this was no, because
They opened the airport. So there was 2 flights that were leaving that day. One was another one of Glenn Beck's.
Yep, that was
planes.
the first flight off the ground post collapse, and it
First private flight. We're not going to say.
Okay.
there are folks that they
Some
needed to
folks
get
that
out,
they were-
right?
yeah.
But I mean, we were literally the second plane that was supposed to get off the ground, you know.
And the first plane hadn't even taxied yet. It hadn't
they were
taxied.
right in front of us, right?
Yeah.
So this was all happening. Like, they were only allowing 2 planes to take off every 24 hours. So
Holy cow.
So we see the other 737 start taxiing to the runway, and it taxis to the hammerhead, but it's just sitting there. It hasn't taken off yet. It's not a great sign, but we're going to continue executing. So the girls start getting on the plane, and then the Cam Air guy tells me, so the Taliban accepted our paperwork. The Johnny letters worked.
the Johnny letter
We're like,
worked.
oh my gosh. And that actually became kind of a de facto standard for all the other private flights that were leaving Afghanistan for the next few months. So they get on the airplane. We're getting all these text messages. I think you're still asleep, right?
No,
or had I woken you up by now?
Yeah, I was like just after midnight was when I came back online.
Yeah.
Because I was coordinating with the ground
manager
throughout that piece.
So we started getting these pictures of the girls on the plane. They have no idea where they're going. Imagine the desperation. They've been through all of this. They're getting on an airplane now. No idea. For all they know, we could be taking them to Tehran or Moscow. They have no idea where we're going because we have to assume compromise. And we still didn't tell them. And they get on the airplane, and obviously they're ecstatic. We're getting these videos. You know, Farkunda's beside herself. Me, I'm just like, wow, I finally get to go to sleep. And we're watching we had the tail number, so we're watching the tail number. We see the tail number start squawking on flight tracking software, and we're like, okay, well, that's a decent sign. And
meaning it was in the air?
No,
or
they just turned on their transponder.
They turned on their transponder. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they show up now.
And then we see the first flight take off on flight tracking software. We're like, oh, is this like real? This is going to happen? And it took a while. I'd say probably a good hour or so. But then we get word that the door's closed. We see the plane start taxiing. They make it to the hammerhead.
Like
we see the ground speed indicators start moving in the positive 100%. Direction, and then it's flying. And we're like, okay. And at this point,
and I just want to say this, right? Official, like I have the screenshot, but you can at 03:33 local time.
Yeah, for us
on 19th of September is when the flight went wheels up.
Yeah. So at this point, though, I'm just expecting the worst because of everything that's happened, which, like, I'm an eternal optimist, really. But I'm not
happy till it's over the border.
Yeah, there's going to be a rocket's going to hit this thing. I'm like, there's going to be, like, this is going to be the most tragic. And the whole time I'm thinking, man, how am I going to, like, if something happens to these girls, how am I going to live with this? Like, how am I going to, like, okay, what's the process I'm going to use to get over what is going to be a pretty significant trauma in my life? Like I've been working through this the whole time, and I'm just like, I know the plane's going to get blown out of the sky. Like something bad's going to happen, and then we see it punched into Turkmen airspace, and I was like, holy smokes! And then it got over the Black Sea, and I was like, I'm going to bed. And we went to bed. I went to bed. You were still up watching the whole thing
with civil aviation authorities, and
because at that point it was just like, okay, now we just kind of got to monitor. They land in Tbilisi, crossload to a Block 3 with no problems. And when they took off from Tbilisi is when they found out that they were going to Lisbon, and then that's when the air crew, I believe it was, started handing out. No, it wasn't the air crew. It was it was the husband of was it the team doctor or somebody like that? It was one of the men who was there. The Cam Air guys had printed out the asylum letters and gave them to him, but he was not to distribute them until they were on their way to Lisbon. And so when they got to altitude out of Tbilisi, he started going around handing out the Portuguese political asylum letters.
Oh, they must have been stoked. They're like, Lisbon, that's like pretty good.
Yeah, because you have one of the biggest soccer stars in the world.
Yeah.
Is from Portugal.
Cristiano Ronaldo.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
So they were just beside themselves. Oh. And at that point, I'd been asleep, and then woke up to they were like somewhere over Italy or something like that, and then they landed in Portugal. The Portuguese government did an absolutely phenomenal job receiving them. Keep in mind, this is in the middle of COVID, so there was they were ready for COVID tests and vaccines and blah 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 and all this stuff. And they took them. The donor ended up. Then we coordinated with another NGO to kind of take over a lot of the aftercare piece, and we took and provide food, clothing, shelter, and all that. And the Portuguese government rogered up for a lot of it too. Keep in mind, there's some things that happened where the Portuguese government kind of owed us, and then we coordinated with some legal aid to help them with paperwork and all that stuff. And then at that point, all of the women and girls who had kind of lost faith were suddenly like, holy smokes, what do we do? And we're like, well, called the donor. I'm like, you still on the hook? He's like, yep. I was like, cool, Zach, let's do it again. and so we got another 100 and some.
Well, so 80 people on the first flight.
Okay.
And we were the second flight out of Afghanistan post collapse.
Wow.
Right, and I want to say it was like it was before, it was a week hadn't even passed since that happened, and it was maybe even the next day someone reached out to me, and I let them know that, like, hey, this flight, they didn't believe me, right? They're like, there's been no flights. I said, well, there was two, and ours was the second one. And so then, I think as Nick mentioned, like the Johnny letter, some of these things, some of these mechanisms and lessons learned, certainly we shared with.
Yeah, we started disseminating those to other people,
other folks, so they could get their people off, because everyone had people in similar situations that they were getting off. They're trying to get out of the country, right?
Right.
Like everyone was doing that.
Yeah. So we started disseminating, hey, here's what worked. And then we actually caught a couple of people taking credit for the work that we had done.
That did happen.
That they were the ones who did all this. I'm like, cool, show me the invoice, because I can show you the invoice for the jet fuel and the light, right? Yeah. I mean, I got millions of dollars worth of invoices here. And so we said, all right, let's do this again. And then and at this point, I think the Portuguese were very skeptical that we could pull this off. Heck, we were skeptical that we could pull this off, but because they'd been hearing all the same stuff that we'd been hearing, and we were in direct contact with essentially their Secretary of Defense equivalent and his attaché and his aide, and they started doing all this work. Well, then they were like, hey, you guys actually pulled this off. Can you do it again? And so we were able to, again, do some drug deals, and we were able to then get the second group of women and girls, which, do you remember how many were on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, so just
100.
Context, like not all of the team got out the first flight.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them,
They just lost faith and decided to go.
well, not only that, but like some didn't even leave Kabul there at the beginning.
Or we actually had one mother who didn't tell us about her
I saw that.
her young children because she didn't think it was relevant. She told us about her and her daughter, who was the soccer player, but she did not tell us about her 2 other young children that she had with her. Well, the Taliban wasn't allowing anybody who didn't have paperwork out, and we hadn't created paperwork.
Oh, no.
Because we didn't know.
Because we didn't know about them.
Oh.
So we were getting these panic calls about, what do you do? What do you do? And unfortunately, these are decisions that we have a lot of experience making, and we were like, you're not going. Do not get on the bus. And we had to call Ray and tell him to tell his bus drivers to keep this mother from getting on the bus and evacuating her 2 young kids. That was heartbreaking.
But
Yeah,
But it was the right call. It was the right call. And so she was very incentivized to get out the second time around.
Yeah.
As were the other folks who weren't able to get out on the first round. And so, but that took a while, because once we had been successful the first time, well, then there was a combination of professional jealousy, people wanting to know why we were able to do it and not them, right? Then there was a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of official government entities getting mad at other official government entities, and we kind of got caught in the middle of that. And then once the Portuguese realized that we were real and we can actually get stuff done, then they realized, I think, that they needed to play a little more officially. And so they started requiring a lot more paperwork and whatnot on the people that we were bringing out. But ultimately, that was successful as well.
It was. I mean, we had I think we reset within less than a week.
Oh, yeah.
Between the first successful flight out, right, and then diving back into round 2.
And we knew we had to move fast, because we knew that Imran Khan was increasingly losing power, right? Because the way that Pakistan works, you essentially have 3 equal branches of government, but the military essentially is the vice president, and the judicial branch is kind of another version of the vice president. So any 2 branches decide to gang up on the executive branch, and they can overthrow the executive branches, is the way that their government works. So we already had indications that Imran Khan was losing power, and when he loses power, then we kind of know some of the backstory on why that was happening and some of the other players involved in the Middle East. So because they were trying to consolidate power in Afghanistan. So once he loses power, that letter no longer works. This could happen in the next 2 hours. It could happen in the next 2 weeks. We have no idea.
Yeah, that was
so
happening.
We're trying to work as fast as we can.
You already mentioned there were other government agencies starting to get more involved at that point. Like the landscape was changing rapidly, right?
Right.
And we knew it would take just kind of moving through the pieces of what it actually took to get that flight off the ground, with the different levels of paperwork and engaging at different Ministry of Defense, and Civil Aviation Authority levels in varying countries. Like, it takes time to, even though we now knew that this mechanism worked, it still takes time. Now it flowed much more smoothly, but we kept running into paperwork delays, and it took another 4 weeks approximately, but we did get the second flight off the ground in November 16th. Okay. We got another 231.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the second flight was a tad bit larger
three
than the first.
times as many people.
Well, now obviously people had a lot more trust
Right.
in the mechanism. We had a lot more trust in the mechanism. We knew what would work.
Yeah.
And then so we were able to pull that off.
310, almost just shy of 315 people over 2 flights.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. And what's really important, and I think the Portuguese government deserves an amazing amount of credit here, because a lot of the people who are evacuated out of Afghanistan went to refugee camps in other countries in the Middle East. Those refugee camps are being closed down. My understanding is a lot of those folks are getting sent back to Afghanistan, which for many of them will be a death sentence. I've talked, many women and girls that I've talked to said, this friend who's Persian, she said she would rather die than live under the Taliban because of what that means, for her quality of life. And these women and girls and their families and the people that we evacuated, they currently are either already Portuguese citizens or are still in the process of becoming Portuguese citizens. And they actually formed a de facto Afghan national soccer team in exile in Lisbon.
That's
wow.
awesome. That's awesome.
Oh, that is just, man,
so,
that gives you goosebumps.
So they went from, I will never kick a ball again, to actually an opportunity to become a FIFA world player.
Wow.
Right. So when you look at the impact, right, and that kind of tends to be how I tend to measure things, is financial impact is one thing, but when you can have global impact is really when you start having impact at scale on people's lives. Mm-hmm. So of these over 300 people that were evacuated from a little office in Whitefish, Montana, with a bunch of people in DC and a woman in Toronto and a guy in Baltimore, and kind of all rallying together, what are one of their kids going to do, right? Is this going to be the next female soccer superstar, right? Is this going to be the next role model for other women? I mean, we have absolutely no idea of the ripple effects of the positive impact that this type of thing will have across the globe. And it just goes to show that even when you think you're absolutely done, I mean, we would have quit at any one of those failures. I mean, we're talking 8 or 9 failed attempts, right? Now, a lot of the failed attempts the girls didn't know about, right?
Sure.
It was because we were within hours of pushing the execute button, and we got shut down by somebody else, right? But, so a lot of it, they didn't know about them. But so to their mind, there was a total of probably 6 attempts, but there was a dozen or more actual attempts. And so if at any time we would have quit, nobody would have faulted us. Everybody would have said, hey, you tried your best. You did your absolute darndest. There's nothing more you could have done. But just that sheer tenacity and grit, and at no time I don't think were we thinking about quitting
that thought
because
never
of
crossed
us.
Never crossed my mind.
Yeah,
Because
these are lives on the line.
If we hit one dead end, and because it happened over and over again, if we hit one dead end in a course of action that we were trying to execute, we just shift to the next one.
Yeah.
And then we shift to the next one, and then the next one.
And then you start taking components of different ones and combining them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
it just never occurred to me that we're gonna give up. If we hadn't gotten that plane off the ground, we would have come up with another plan.
Right. Yeah.
And we were actively working executed.
Yeah, we're actively working with the Tajiks to get the girls across the border on ground, actively working with Pakistanis to possibly bring them through Peshawar.
We were working multiple angles while we were working our primary angle.
Yeah,
we had
smart.
A lot of backup plans that we were still pushing the ball forward on.
Yeah.
A lot of different plans.
Yeah.
Had you guys ever done anything like this before in your careers, or did anything come close to?
Oh yeah,
not to this level, right? I mean, I was engaging with Ministry of Foreign Affairs and senators and stuff on a very regular basis, and that was to that degree was new for me,
Sure.
for sure. And in particular, running out of my home office or this office at the wee hours of the morning was interesting. Yeah.
When I was right after I got out of pararescue, I was working for some private personnel recovery company and facilitated the evacuation of the first 27 Americans out of Lebanon in 2006 when Israelis and the Lebanese decided to have a little party.
Yeah.
And so I had that was my first time doing something like that. I did a considerable number of things at the agency that were adjacent to this. Obviously, I had much larger levers I could pull, but in some ways we had a little more freedom to maneuver in this aspect, because when I was at the agency, I didn't have carte blanche authority to just go start working with a Portuguese or anybody I wanted, right? I mean, trust me, that had to go very high up a chain and trickle all the way back down to me before I could do something like that. So in some ways, this was easier with some of the more creative solutions, but then in other ways, it was much harder. Because we had no official authority over anything or anyone.
Well, and that's what I'm referring to, right? It's like to just, your imagination, like, okay, I guess we're just going to cold call Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Portugal and see how far we get, right? I mean, those were the kind of conversations that were happening. I had to throw an international plan so I could call whoever at whatever hour of the day in order to ask about how we're going to do a particular process, what paperwork was required, dealing with, in particular. And I didn't, you would think Civil Aviation Authority, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was like the left and right hand, and they definitely didn't talk, right? And so you'd think Civil Aviation Authority was at least aware that we were trying to route flights through that country, and that was absolutely not the case. And so some really unique hurdles or challenges to try to figure out and overcome.
To, like you said earlier, to make sure everyone knows what's going on, who needs to know, to make sure someone's like, that plane's not supposed to be there, we need to bring it down.
Right. It's high consequence, very, very high consequence. And so that's why we wanted to make sure we executed right. But by and large, while this was a different problem set, it's not that much different from what your average special ops and intelligence operator deal with on a daily basis. I mean, it's not like you have a standard problem set that you just deal with all the time. It's always something different, and that's really where the soft training, I think, and experience came in, and the intel training and experience came in to help us get really creative with the different things that we could put together, different solutions.
Wow. So what are the girls up to now? They're playing soccer, obviously, and they're Portuguese citizens.
Playing soccer. Some of them are already football for them. There's a documentary that was filmed that came out that was released at Tribeca at the film festival called, I think it's Ayanda or Ayanda.
Yep.
So there's that. I think it was purchased by, I don't know, some company. I think it goes public in October, September time frame. There's a number of Farkunda, really. So she was trying to be a teacher, and then this actually kind of provided a launch pad for her to go do really big things. So she's not only coaching this Afghan exile team in Portugal, she's also playing professional football herself for, I think, the Norwegian or the Swedish team or somebody like that, right? Nice. So she's playing professional football. Yeah. She's doing speaking tours. She's, her courage in taking this on and not just saying, well, what do you want me to do? And actually putting her feet forward and doing things has really worked out well for her. So we're very, very proud of Farkunda, and just to see a young Muslim woman who was on a very traditional track, really through this experience understand that she can accomplish anything that she puts her mind to. So she's gone on to do really great things.
Man, it'd be awesome if you guys could get to Portugal and go kick the ball around with these girls. That would be. Any plans to like be able to do that at all, or?
I don't have
I'd
any.
love to.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't really have any
I
right
don't.
now.
I don't have anything in the works, but that.
Yeah. Where's that donor? Sounds like we've got one more thing we
Exactly.
need from you.
There you go. That'd be great.
Yeah.
That's good. That would be the perfect ending. How do you decompress from something like that? Because you had just retired. So
I told Nick, don't ever call me again.
And here he is. And by the way, I called him again, and he said yes for another thing that we were doing.
Especially after the.
Yeah.
Well, then, we did another operation.
We did another one. The second time, though, I put down some pretty firm boundaries, and I told some of the people involved, I said, look, we have 100% operational control and authority, and if you don't agree to that up front, we're not playing.
Yeah.
And they said okay, and so that one was still frustrating, but it didn't quite go as planned. But that's really where that was. But as far as like kind of decompression, I mean, this is what we've dealt with for decades of our life. Yeah. So I mean, you sleep, you eat, you move on to the next thing.
I mean, it was, like I said, I was really having a hard time with the way we were withdrawing from Afghanistan. Yeah. And for me, it just provided an opportunity to, one more time, to kind of give back and really be at ease personally with how that went down.
Yeah.
Because that end of August of that year of 21 was not a great time for me, and so this kind of really turned that whole thing around in my mind, and I'm kind of at peace now with that.
Yeah,
because of this opportunity.
Yeah, and every friend I have who died in Afghanistan, and there was a number of them, every single one of them would have been proud of the work that we did, and that's kind of the way that I look at it. So.
Wow.
Yeah, lives were changed and saved for the positive.
Can you speak to like how you think the withdrawal should have been handled?
Oh, that's a deep rabbit hole.
Is that another episode?
Well,
that's a deep rabbit hole.
I don't think it's deep. There was a plan. And there was a plan that went all the way back to George W. Bush on withdrawal. And it was from the main military outpost outside of Kabul, and from the main airfield, which is like 50 miles of nothing in any direction, right? I mean, a very safe way to do it, very orderly. And the arrogance and political brinksmanship, and it's really the political brinksmanship side that caused the problems, where you have an administration that did not want to execute on a plan because it was somebody else's idea. And it wasn't another administration's idea. It was those generals and captains and majors and E9s and E8s and special operators who put together that plan a decade and a half before. Because keep in mind, nobody thought we'd be in Afghanistan as long as we were. So the withdrawal plan was already on paper. All they had to do was execute. And saying, we want to execute, we want to extend the timeline, we want to make it happen on a very specific day for symbolism and in media purposes, that's hubris. And then the brinksmanship of saying, we'll use any plan except the good plan, because that good plan was not our idea. That's what caused the problem. Had they just followed the plan, of which, was probably put together when you were an E5, and the E9s in your unit were involved in putting that together, and that plan got refined and changed. And I mean, it was dialed in. I know what the plan was. It was dialed in on what everybody was supposed to do, where everybody was supposed to go, and the orderly withdrawal, and the way that we were going to support the Afghan forces, and essentially kind of force them to ride the bike without training wheels, but be there to tend the scuffed knees, so to speak, until they were completely balancing on their own. There was a plan, and not following the well-established plan that was established by the experts with actual time on the ground is what led to the chaos. There's a whole chain of events before, things that we did in Afghanistan, things that we shouldn't have done in Afghanistan, things that we turned a blind eye to as a country. Yes, those are all factors. But from a withdrawal perspective, if they just would have followed the plan.
Yeah, poor execution. I mean, I've said that from the beginning. Like poor execution.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
all from Whitefish, Montana.
All from Whitefish, Montana, and as civilians.
Yes.
Like you.
Correct.
I mean, I think like this country can be very proud and happy to know there are individuals like you two that are willing to do this kind of work, because that doesn't come around very much. So you guys are role models and examples that I think we should all be very thankful for. So this is kind of probably cliche. You heard a lot, but thank you for your service, because this is going above and beyond.
Thanks for your support.
Yeah. Thanks for your support and making this happen.
I'm happy to pay my taxes as long as it's going to people like you guys. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for being on Hello Whitefish for this very special episode. I hope this story gets out. I hope other people want to come and talk to you, because the story is amazing, and this little podcast is a small venue that hopefully gets the story out and more people interested. So thank you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Cheers.